speciated into what we see today. So we do not deny that all of the felines probably came from one animal, specifically two animals, the two that were on the ark. What we disagree is that cats and dogs also evolved from the same animal. We believe that no, they were created separately and then speciated from those separate kinds. Okay, that is to say, adaptation is not evolution. I get so sick and tired of, we know evolution is true, just look at the finches in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, that is adaptation. They are still birds. They are still finches. Those birds are not starting to grow gills and starting to become fish. They're not starting to lose their feathers and grow scales. Their feathers aren't turning into fur. They're always birds. And in fact, what we're actually finding with those finches is it's a generational thing. A finch with a long pointed beak, its offspring could have a short, thick beak, and then that offspring can have the long pointed beak again. This is just adaptation depending upon the seasons, depending on the weather, depending upon the climate. Creationists agree. Animals adapt to their environment. Okay. Evolution is mutation. Okay, specifically mutation that changes one thing into another. Yeah, we laugh at this, we joke at this, but this is the kind of thing you should be seeing in evolution. Maybe not to this extent, but to this idea. That the idea is if bovine one day became dolphins, which is what the evolutionists say happened, that we should be seeing cows today with dorsal fins and blowholes. Because you have to have that progression until you eventually get to a dolphin. But how does mutations really work? Okay, well, let's say you have this string of DNA. Okay, this doesn't mean anything, but let's say for the record that this is the DNA code that determines the lactate ability of a human. All right, and what happens is when a human is born, they can process lactate, they can process milk, but as they grow up, it stops working and we become lactose intolerant, okay? That is the natural form of the human genome, okay? But let's say they have a child and the genetic code gets changed a little bit and all of a sudden, now this AT becomes a TA. We've mutated. The DNA is now different. Now what does this do? It does one of three things. Every mutation can fall under these categories. One, it's a degradential mutation. This mutation somehow harms the original thing. This can be cleft chin, this can be Down syndrome, this can be autism, this can take form in many shapes, but the idea is that this mutation harms the new creature, okay? The second type of mutation is a benign mutation. This simply means that yes, it's changed, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change anything. It's exactly the same. Usually this happens because the DNA has enough redundancies that it's not so much that this is a benign mutation, but that whatever this did, other parts of the DNA can compensate for and make it work. Which again, I kind of pose a question, why would evolution build in redundancies? That seems to be counterintuitive to how evolution would work. It's almost as if somebody created it knowing that it was going to degrade over time and built redundancies for when failures happen. But as is the case with lactate, this is the most common kind of mutation. It's not that something changed, it's you lost something. If we say that the ATTA part here was the part that was the timer, so when you're born, You have this little enzyme that can break down lactate, but as you grow up, a little timer switches, boom, it stops producing, and you can no longer produce or can no longer break down lactate, and you become lactose intolerant. But if we get rid of that, that timer doesn't ever activate, therefore you can drink milk your entire life. And that is actually what happened for the most part in the European population. It's why most people in Africa and Asia still have a form of lactose intolerance, but Europeans can drink milk their entire lives. It's because we have lost this part of our DNA that takes away our lactose enzyme. However, you notice anything about this? We've had this positive mutation, but we're now missing genetic information. We haven't gained an ability, we've lost an ability. Now, the loss of that ability is positive, but it's still a loss. To put it more succinctly, let's think of a house, okay? Say you're living in your house, and you have your living room, and right next to it you have your man cave. Okay, and your wife one day says, "Hey, honey, I think we need the living room to be bigger. So let's take down the wall separating the living room and the man cave, and let's make it all the living room." Now, your wife is asking you this, therefore you completely agree it is the great idea, and you take away the wall, and this is a beneficial thing because now the wife is happy. Okay? And anytime the wife is happy, we all know that's a benefit. However, I haven't added anything to the house. I've taken part of the house away. Okay? Evolution states that we should start with a shack and we should be continually building onto that shack until eventually we have a 4-story mansion. But genetic mutation shows it's the opposite. We have a 4-story mansion and we're slowly whittling it down into a shack. So, on mutations and on DNA, let's talk about junk DNA. Now, this is one of those things, and if you haven't noticed it before, congratulations, you will now notice it for the rest of your life, and that is every single science fiction, TV show, movie, book will probably at some point mention junk DNA. This is the magic wand of evolution. In fact, there was an episode of Star Trek where you see the junk DNA in their bodies got activated and they started taking on the characteristics of these things. Well, the idea of junk DNA is that as we evolved from fish to lizards to birds or to reptiles or to whatever, that we don't get rid of that DNA as we keep evolving up. We still keep that DNA, but we're constantly evolving and getting new DNA, and we're using that new DNA, but that old DNA still lingers, and it's not doing anything. It's pointless. It's junk. Now, some time ago, there was the ENCODE project. Now, they analyzed just 1% of the human genome. Now, if evolution is true and we have all this junk DNA, we should have found in that 1% that most of that DNA, if not all of that DNA, was useless. But what they actually found is that 80% of the genome had some sort of biochemical activity. Now, we don't necessarily know what it was doing, but if it's active, if it's doing something, chances are pretty good it's important and we want it to keep doing it. And that is not to say that the remaining 20% wasn't doing anything, we just can't see that it's doing anything. But this indicates that 80% of our genome, at the minimum, isn't junk DNA. Well, that's interesting. They concluded much of junk is used to make non-coding RNA, originally assumed to be transitional nonsense from dead genes, now known to have key regulatory roles. Okay? What they thought was junk actually, it's very important. Now, what's the big deal about this? Well, as was said in National Geographic, if our genome was 80% functional, the figure battered around when the ENCODE project results first came out, then we should be extinct. Well, wait a second, what? What are they talking about here? Well, what he's referring to is that if, for instance, we use 100% of our DNA, that all of our DNA is important and is used in the body. And as we see, we have a 1% degradation between each generation. Means your kids, slight mutation in their DNA, it degrades just a little bit, and then their kids, it degrades just a little bit. Not enough that it has any immediate impact, but over time, it adds up. What you would have is in about 300 generations, about 7,000 to 8,000 years, you would have what's called air catastrophe. Air catastrophe is when the genome of a certain gene pool gets so small, gets so degraded, that the species can no longer reproduce. And what you have happen is you start here, it's fine, but as you start getting lower and lower, negative mutations start to build, and you start to see an influx in offspring being born with genetic deficiencies, such as cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome. Not to say we haven't had that all throughout history, but you'll start getting more and more and more and more of that as we get closer and closer. Yep. I think my pen just died. As we get closer and closer to air catastrophe. However, as I just said, 300 generations, that's 7,000 years. Evolution says we're supposed to be here for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. In order for the mutations to work the way that evolution is saying, what they want to say is, you see, 75% of our DNA or more is junk DNA. So yes, we get a 1% degradation between each generation, but that 1% is in junk. It doesn't do anything anyway, so it doesn't matter if it's degrading. In fact, that's beneficial because we can get rid of the junk DNA and we can make room for new DNA that's going to make us into the next level of evolution, whatever that is. But 75%, 80% is what we use. At best, we only have 20% junk DNA. So, according to Biology and Evolution in 2021, they admit junk DNA, it doesn't work. We do use this. In fact, if you want to be honest, even at the time of that Star Trek episode, most biologists knew that junk DNA was not as prevalent as they needed it to be, but they were kind of just keeping it hush. But now it is just getting to the point where they can no longer deny it publicly that, yeah, we can't use this anymore. So, let's talk about the monkey in the room. Again, and again, if you haven't heard this before, you'll definitely notice it now. Just about every time science, something or other, Hubble law, they're talking about DNA, they will mention the fact humans and chimpanzees are 97% genetically similar to each other. So, therefore, that is proof of evolution. Because why would we be so closely genetically related to these people if, in fact, we weren't? This was given to me. This is an actual magazine that was given to me in my 8th grade science class. And it is talking about how because chimpanzees are so closely related to humans, we should start categorizing chimpanzees as a form of human. Ironically, this is probably the most tame thing that we're seeing today, but back then it was a big deal. So, where does that come from? So the idea comes, this was made in the Smithsonian, by the way, is that here you got Humans up at the top, and then you'll see these skulls here, and then you'll see more of them right here. This is all the skulls of the chain of monkey to human. It'll start down in the blue. There we go. This is early humanoids, and up here you have the homos. Grow up. And then us way up here at the top. Okay? But I challenge you. What is missing from this picture? Can anyone see just from looking at this picture? There's something drastically missing from it. Well, no, chimps, they're right here. No, what's missing is we're not related to any of these skulls. There is nothing in the skull or fossil record of our supposed ancestors. It says that all these other skulls were cousins of our ancestors, but they're not our ancestors. We're not finding anything that we're supposedly related to. But we know they're there, obviously, because evolution is true, but we just haven't found them yet. Okay, so I am going to go through, before I do that. So, if you look at these two skulls, you look at them and you go, wow, these skulls, drastically different. I'm willing to bet if you found this skull, you'd go, this is probably some sort of pre-human, some sort of Neanderthal or similar Cro-Magnon adjacent type of thing. Well, actually, this is, and my thing died again, this is a human that died in the past 100 years. Both of these skulls are Eskimos. Now, why do they look so different? Well, it's because Eskimos, in the environment that they are living in, don't have a lot of tools. So what they do is they use their jaw as one of their main tools. They'll take the fat and they'll rip and they'll tear and they'll push and they'll use it to pull and stuff. So they are constantly forming and using their jaw to the point where it deforms to the point where it no longer looks like a normal human jaw. But that's not genetic. That's environmental. If this guy had a child, their child's skull would look like a normal child. So who were we to say that some of these skulls, oh yeah, they look different than a human skull today, but were they born that way? Or did the environment that they live in shape the skull so it looks different, and now we don't have any genetic information to tell what it would have originally looked like? Again, not saying that is 100% the case, but I am saying that is often something that is not talked about. And in fact, a lot of skulls that are quote-unquote the missing link of humans either found out to be one, completely faked, or two, just a human skull. They find out later, oh, this is actually Joe from 80 years ago. Didn't realize it was him. Whoops. So, humans and chimps, 97% similar. And yet, the human genome contains 3.1 billion bases, and the chimp contains 3.35 billion bases. That means that there is about a 9% difference in the size of the chimp genome compared to the human genome. Now, when I told this to my science teacher one time, she said, well, but we're not concerned about the size of the genome. What we're concerned about is comparing the two genomes together. How similar are they? To which I say, if I want to compare these two books, and I tell you that these books are 97% similar to each other, what is the first thing you say? Yeah, the size is completely different. There's no way these two books are the same book, that they're 97% similar, because one is drastically larger than the other. It's just not possible. But okay, you know what? Let's ignore the 9% and let me show you in a representation how they determined the 97% accuracy. I've got two sentences here. Methinks it is a weasel, and we have the inks to sell. Okay? I'm going to compare these two lines of information, and I'm going to prove that they are 95% accurate or 95% similar to each other using the same method that the scientists did to prove that chimps and humans are 97% similar. So we have inks. Well, we got I and K that's there, so 1 for 1. We're at 100% so far. There's a W. There's another W, 2 for 2, still at 100%. We're getting good. There is SEL, and there's SEL. So, man, we're at 95% similarities there, so long as we ignore the V and O because it's too big. Okay, now if you look at that and you go, that is ridiculous and stupid, you are correct. And in fact, it does border on a level of, are they being willfully malicious in the interpretation of the data? According to UCSC, in February of 2009, they admit that 50% of the human Y chromosome, which is what they were testing, has no alignment to the chimpanzee chromosome. Okay. Again, this is not us saying that. This is them. Moreover, on the percent differences between humans and chimpanzees, a person whose name I'm not even going to try and pronounce in the Science magazine said, I do not think there is a way to calculate the number. In the end, is a political and social and cultural thing about how we see our differences. How did they determine the 97%? We made it up. Cultural, political, and social differences, or social pressures, determined that chimpanzees and humans need to be 97% similar. Therefore, we made it so that we are. Yeah.
How do they explain that there are still chimpanzees?
Well, evolution is a slow process, and certain mutations happen in certain areas. So the idea is like with the original cell, with Luca, as the cell starts migrating over here and it develops a new mutation that's beneficial and starts growing, all of these are still growing, but they just don't have the mutation. But now that this mutation has taken hold, it's now a new species of mutation, and so they now are parallel to each other, and then this one will mutate a little bit, and this one will mutate a little bit, but these two will keep on going. So you get a spider web going out of that. So yes, you would expect, but you see, that's my argument. In that skull thing that I showed you, they were our cousins, but where are our ancestors? Where are the animals that supposedly both us and the chimpanzees evolved from? Why aren't they around anymore? Now, evolutionists will say that, well, the factors changed which caused those speciation to begin with, and therefore they died out, to which it's, well, then where are the bones? We find bones for everything else. Where are the bones for this animal? Well, we just haven't found them yet. Eventually, one day, we dig deep enough, we'll find them. Yes?
Are there any other animals or plants that humans share a high percentage of DNA with?
Okay, so the question is, are there any other animals or plants that we share a high percentage of DNA with? Again, depending on the methodology. If you are going simply on biochemically, the answer is yes. Humans are 75% water. Most animals, most plants contain mostly water. But genetically, when you break down the genetic code, no. And in fact, you will find no animal is similar to any other animal. Okay? I cannot take the genetic makeup of a cat and the genetic makeup of a dog, compare them together and be like, wow, these are 50% similar. No. They are so genetically diverse from each other that it just doesn't work. The idea is that they needed chimpanzees and humans to be closely related, because the idea is that chimpanzees and humans are so close to each other on the genetic timescale that it should be like if I took a tiger and a lion and compared them genetically, they would be very similar to each other. So therefore, I should be able to take a chimpanzee and a human and compare them because we're in the same class of species. Well, actually, no, we're not. But if we said that, then that means that humans evolved from something else that wasn't primates. But if we didn't evolve from primates, then what did we evolve from? Nothing we can see, hear, or know of today. So therefore, that kind of puts a little damper on the whole evolutionary thing. Now, to tie up genetics, I'm going to go over mitochondrial Eve. Now, this can get a little complicated, so again, you need me to slow down and explain something, please just say so. But genetically, how children work, you take mama's DNA and you take dad's DNA. You take 50%, 50%, you put them in a bowl, you mix it together, and boom, that's the offspring. Okay? Now, this is fine. This is how we get diversification of people. This is how, we get different character traits. There's nothing wrong with this. However, you cannot take Brian's DNA, for instance, take his DNA, string it out, and go, okay, this is his mom's DNA, this is his dad's DNA, so we can now map out the 50% that is Brian's dad and the 50% that is Brian's mom. Can't do that. What we can do is we can take Brian's mom's DNA and Brian's DNA and we can compare them and go, okay, these 50% all match up, therefore we can tell that this is Brian's mom. But you can't really go backwards onto that. The difference is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is a DNA strand that you get only from your mother. That means my mitochondria DNA is exactly the same as my mother's mitochondria DNA, with a slight variation due to mutation. But what that means is you can take my mitochondria DNA and you can work backwards and figure out what my grandmother's mitochondria DNA was. And you can figure out what my great-grandmother's mitochondria DNA. The difference is because this only passes from the mother that with sons, they never pass on their mitochondria DNA. So we don't know what the mitochondria of men necessarily are going back far enough, but we always know what the mitochondria of the women is in the lineage. But that means that if I take a bunch of people today and I kind of go back through the history, I should be able to see what our first ancestors look like. And you take all the DNA and you put it on a map, it looks like this. Now, I know this is a bunch of lines and stuff, but each of these lines, at the end point, that's the person that they tested, and you go back far enough into the line and you start seeing where they converge. Now, an interesting point here is everybody in the world, their DNA, their mitochondrial DNA converges on one point. Every single person in here, their mitochondrial DNA comes from one woman. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Almost as if, the Bible. But I'll do you one better. It's not just one point that every DNA converges on. It actually, from that one point, it breaks off into 3 points. Now, why is that significant? Because Noah had 3 sons. He had no daughters. Those sons had wives. So, all of the mitochondria, according to a biblical view, should come from 3 women that go into one. Exactly like what we see here. Now, that being said, when they did this, they found that the age of this mitochondria Eve, now make no mistake, they did not call it mitochondria Eve as some sort of homage to the biblical. It was more of a tongue-in-cheek joke. Oh, we found Eve. But they determined that mitochondria Eve lived about 1,500,000 years ago. So, got you, creationist. Yes, there was an Eve, but your Bible says she only lived 6,000 years ago, and we found out, no, 150,000 years ago. Therefore, Bible wrong. Well, how did they get this? They added the mitochondria of chimpanzees. Why? Because we're 97% similar to chimpanzees, therefore, their mitochondria should be included in all of it. But when you take the chimpanzees out, what do you get? You get mitochondria Eve about 6,000 years ago. And by the way, again, this is not me saying this. This is Science Magazine in 1998. Using the new clock, she, mitochondria Eve, would be a mere 6,000 years old. Again, the evidence is overwhelming, and you have to be willfully ignorant in order to ignore it. In fact, in Nature magazine, in 2013, they said that most of the changes to the mitochondria Eve probably happened in the past 5,000 to 10,000 years. Now think about that for a second. Mitochondria Eve is supposed to be 150,000 years old, but most of the changes that we see happened in the past 10,000 years. It's almost as if maybe mitochondria Eve isn't actually that old and is really much younger and is what we would expect to find. According to Nature, in 2004, the genealogical ancestor of all present-day people lived at about 3000 BC. Again, this is not us saying that. This is Nature magazine saying that. Hardcore evolutionist won't allow a divine foot in the door. Mitochondria Eve lived 5,000 years ago. Okay, so that's pretty much it for what we have in our class. Again, this is where I I want to open it up to all of you. I know I just front-loaded a lot of stuff onto you, so if you have questions, now is the time to be asking them. Yes?
So, you mentioned that the mitochondria is only passed down from the mother. There's now a lot of DNA, people who are looking deep for DNA to find their ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean they only actually find the mother's
Okay.
So that you can't find the
Yeah.
father?
So she's asking about doing the DNA ancestry testing. Are they using the mitochondria DNA to do it? The answer is a lot of them, yes. A lot of them do only look at the mitochondria to get your ancestors. Now you see, that's not to say that I can't look at your genetic code and see that, oh, there's Caucasian and there's, African and stuff like that. But that does get jumbled. It gets very quickly jumbled in terms of all of that. So the further back you go, the harder it does become to suss out what all of these genes mean in terms of your ancestry. But yes, if you take the mitochondria DNA, you can go back to the beginning and basically trace your entire family history, but only through the mother. And I do find it interesting, Brian, maybe you can correct me, but doesn't the Bible say something about how your ancestry is passed through your mother's side of the family?
Most genealogies are going through fathers.
Okay.
But there are several mentioned women in genealogies. So I don't know. I mean, in terms of how they listed the father would be most important.
Sure, but it's like okay. It's something that just came to my mind right now. Is like that the mother was actually the importance of, but well, we can look at that later. But yes, so a lot of them will say something on the test if how they get their information. And I know like the 23andMe specifically, that it is the mitochondria that they are looking at. Okay, yes?
So they think we evolved from one single cell. Do they think we're still evolving, and if so, to what?
Okay, so he asked if we evolved from a single cell, are we still evolving, and if to what? The answer is yes, and they don't know. You see, the key for evolution is through adaptation. So what they will say is that as our environment changes, we will adapt to the environment. I'll go back to the bovine and the dolphin. Supposedly, what happened was the bovine was living on the land next to the ocean, but as food became more scarce, and as droughts and all that stuff happened, the bovine started migrating closer and closer to the water and started relying more on fish and stuff to survive, and therefore they started adapting themselves to be more living in aquatic until eventually they just fully adapted and became dolphins. Now, how quickly that happened, they would say, well, it took tens of millions of years. To which I would say, if a drought is lasting 10 million years, the cow is dead. It's not going to have time to evolve. If it is really so necessary, food is so scarce that we need to become a dolphin to get into the ocean, you're not going to have 10 million years to adapt and become that dolphin. Like, either the food is there and you live, or it's not and you die. Like, that's just how that works. But I'll even go a step further than that, because I've challenged several people on this. Name a beneficial mutation that gets you from a cow to a dolphin. You see, that's the thing. Not only do the mutations have to get you closer to a dolphin, but they also have to be beneficial in the here and now. Otherwise, you don't have the propagation of that trait to new things. Because the whole idea of adaptation is, hey, this thing, it allows you to survive longer, therefore you have more kids, therefore your kids are able to survive longer, and they have more kids, so you quickly populate, you outpace the other things that don't have this adaptation. So most adaptations are so benign that yes, technically it is beneficial, but it doesn't give you any significant advantage, and the adaptation dies after a few generations. So with the bovine to the dolphin, you have to not only have adaptations that get you closer to a dolphin, but that adaptation has to be advantageous, allowing that cow to live longer so that it can have more kids, so that it can pass on that trait to the next, so it becomes dominant. What adaptation would that be? A cow with a dorsal fin is going to be picked off by predators faster than a cow without a dorsal fin. A cow with a blowhole has no inherent advantage over a cow without a blowhole. So what advantages can you get slowly evolving, gradually changing over time that is beneficial to the cow that also get to a dolphin? And I've never heard any kind of evolutionary biologist give a good example of that. But number two, as we were talking about with genetics, you have to remember, you're not gaining genetic information through mutation. You're losing genetic information. So if I do not currently have the genetic information in my body for feathers, how then can I have a genetic mutation that gives me feathers? So you can't just take DNA and scramble it a little bit and boom, now it does something completely different. Because again, DNA is a lot like code. And if anybody has done any kind of programming knows a single comma, a single parenthesis out of place destroys the code. It's not that, oh, suddenly it does something else and it does something way better than we ever imagined it to. No, it just doesn't work. In fact, because I do some coding, the joke is there's 99 bugs on the wall, 99 bugs. Take one down, fix it around, 128 bugs in the wall. That's the kind of thing you're dealing with when you're dealing with code. So, how then can you get that from one to another? And I'll even make another point. Darwin, when he was writing The Origins of Life, Species of Life, sorry. Origin of Species, there we go, sorry. Origin of Species. Remember, he was not a biologist. They did not know about genetics. They did not know about cells, or had a very, very basic fundamental understanding of cells. The common concept, the common idea was that cells would be super, super simple, that they would do very little. But the idea is if you got a bunch of cells together, they could work together and they could do complex things. I use it as a Lego analogy. The idea of a single Lego brick is super simple and can't do anything. But if I have enough Lego bricks, I can build something that is complex. But as we're finding out, a single cell in terms of genetics is far more complicated than cities. They have their own roadways, they have their own infrastructures, they have their own post offices, they have their own power system. Okay? In fact, I even read an article that unironically said city developers using the nucleus of a cell to help them lay out new cities. Because cells are so efficient that, hey, if we copy this, we can do it here. But let's, again, give Darwin the benefit of the doubt. Let's say, yes, cells are extremely simple and you can build something complex from them. Let's use an example of a brick wall. Okay? A brick wall, relatively speaking, is extremely simple. It's just rock, some sand, some water mixed in the right thing to make mortar, and they're all stacked on top of each other. How many of you have ever looked at a brick wall and said, I wonder how many millions of years it would take for that to naturally happen? The answer is no. We see a brick wall and we immediately know somebody made that wall. And yet, a brick wall is infinitely less complex than a single living organism, a single cell in a living organism. So why is it we take something that has so much complexity to it and we go random chance? Something that, I did this in an afternoon, had to be a creator. Like, where does that come from? And again, willfully ignorant of their creator. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
If a genetic mutation is the loss of DNA,
Generally speaking.
we've been able to track the rate in humans that we've lost DNA.
Yeah, it's about 1% a generation.
And then we should be able to forecast when we reach that point of stabilization and perhaps entropy.
Yes.
Have we looked at that?
So yes, the general consensus from a creation view would be that we're about 200 to 250 generations in from the start. Yes. So,
Generations since the 6,000 years have we had now?
well, that's the thing. So genetic air catastrophe happens at about 300 generations, give or take. We're at about generation 200 to 250. Like, we're past 200, we're not quite at 250. So generally speaking, that means that humans as a species have 1,000 to 1,500 years left to live. So good news for all of you who are thinking, oh man, what's the world going to be like in 1,000 years? Dead. We're going to be dead. Yeah.
One quick question. How does the DNA compare between a single
Sorry, repeat the question. A single cell organism and what?
The DNA of a single cell organism, how does that compare with a smart multi-cell organism, let's say a
All
monkey,
right.
something like that?
So the question is how does a single cell organism DNA compare to a multi-cell organism? Well, I will tell you what, write that one down and I will give it to Joseph. Next week he'll be able to give you a much more in-depth answer. But the big difference, generally speaking, is function in terms of DNA, is what the DNA function allows it to happen. Because a single cell organism, its function is to survive and reproduce. As opposed to a multi-cell organism, it has DNA that does different functions. So for instance, we have DNA that controls blood vessels. We have DNA that controls, breathing, the rate of white cells that are being made, your immune system and stuff like that. So the idea is that a single strand of DNA from a multi-cell organism is going to be vastly larger than that of a single cell creature because that creature just doesn't have the functionality that a multi-cell organism does. That being said, even a single cell organism has a lot of complexity to it, has a lot of DNA to it, and has a lot of vast structure to it that's beyond just do thing.
Yeah, but I mean, the DNA, if you compare the two, one's smaller, one's bigger, or?
The amount of information is going to be different. Okay, because remember, well, maybe you don't. So DNA is written in a way that you can have the same length, but I can encode a lot more information on one than the other. Again, going back to computer, if you know anything about compressing. So I can have an image that is 100 megabytes in size, and I can take that same image and I can compress it down to 20 megabytes without losing any quality or image degradation from that. But when I compress that to the 20 megabytes, I can now no longer make it 100 megabytes again. Because once it's been compressed, it's been compressed. So, yes, and that becomes how in evolution, because you need to add DNA in order for evolution to work. There needs to be an addition of traits so that the organism can become something new. A lot of times, evolutionists, they will use the photocopy example. The idea is if you take a photocopy of something and then you take the copy of that and you photocopy it, and then you take the copy of that and you photocopy it, you do that 1,000,000 times and eventually the images are going to look different from each other. It's like, yes, but if you take an image of a plane and you photocopy it 1,000,000,000 times, it's not going to look like a cat. It's going to look like a pixelated, blurry mess. And that, you see, I think, is the perfect demonstration of air catastrophe. It's not that by photocopying something over and over and over again, you're getting a new image. It's just you're deteriorating the image quality of what you originally had until the point where you eventually get that you just cannot recognize the image anymore. Okay, anybody else? Yes.
Is there any evidence that you were known of gene editing to chimeras?
Okay. Gene editing into chimeras. Are you meaning like splicing a cat and a dog and making a cat dog type of?
That, but also with humans.
Well, yeah. I am not aware of anything like that. I will tell you right now, again, with coding, I cannot take a C# code and plug it into Python and have it work. It will not work. The code does not talk to each other. The only way I can make it work is if I drastically alter the C# code and change it into a Python code. And even then, there's no guarantee that the Python can perform the action that is wanted to do. Human DNA is even more sensitive to that. Yes, it's extremely resilient. Yes, it's extremely complex, but it also doesn't like being tampered with. Any kind of just little joscillation and it will just shut down and stop working. And I think that is a feature, not a bug, because you want that to happen. If some of your DNA starts going haywire, you want your body to shut that down and just start ignoring it. So I'm not going to say, no, we can't gene splice. And I'm not even saying that it's beyond our necessarily capabilities of today. Will we see one day cat people? Probably not. But can we start giving humans characteristics of certain animals through genetic modification? I won't say no, but again, I would say that's probably a better question for next week when we actually have a doctor in the house who can probably give you a more surefire answer on that one. Yeah.
For me, the way I think about it is, you know, you can mix a horse and a donkey and have a mule.
Mm-hmm.
And that mule loses some abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have, it's my understanding, you can mix a tiger and a lion.
And a liger. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so I guess that's what kind of leads precedence that you can't mix this cat and dog.
Mm-hmm. And that is what I would consider a strong argument, especially for the chimpanzee-human thing. If we really were 97% similar to each other, we should be able to genetically breed with each other. But you can't. You can breed certain types of primates with other primates, but you cannot breed any primate with a human. Kind of implying that, yes, humans and primates are actually different kinds created differently. Yeah. Okay, does the primate have an extra pair of chromosomes that we don't have? Off the top of my head, so the chimpanzee chromosome is much larger than the human chromosome. Yeah, I can't tell you one way or another on that. Again, I would write that one down, and I can answer that for you next week.
Also, with the hybridization, we talked about a mule.
Mm-hmm.
Mule's sterile.
Yes, all crossbreeding is. A liger is sterile, too. Yes. But the implication being that a horse and a donkey once had an ancestor that was related to each other and that they have bred. But yes, essentially when you crossbreed the two, it is genetically bankrupt enough that it has now entered into that air catastrophe level of it can no longer breed because the genome has been so thinned by taking two things from so far apart from each other and breeding them together. Yeah, it can't breed anymore.
It's almost as if someone once said that we will reproduce according to our own kind.
Yeah, exactly. So the comment was that it's almost as if somebody somewhere said that we will reproduce to our own kind. Yeah. Okay. You know, I thought about putting cloning on here. I did. I wasn't sure how much time we'd have. Okay, so the 1,000-foot overview with cloning. One thing we need to remember, or one thing we need to realize or understand, I don't have the exact number, but I will say with certainty, all of the genetic information that distinguishes you physically different from the lady next to you is less than 5% of your DNA. Okay? We are more genetically similar to each other than we are different. And you have to remember, with every new birth, there is about a 1% mutation in the genome. Now, if less than 5% of you is what makes you physically different from the other person, and you have a 1% mutation, that means that you're going to only be 99% similar to the thing that you clone. So my father, he liked to show a picture. It was a picture of hamsters. It was about 100 hamsters, all different colors, all different sizes. They were all cloned from the same hamster. Okay? That is to say, not, again, that we can't get better at cloning, that one day we can't make a one-for-one genetic similarity to that. But in many ways, we already have that. They're called identical twins. All an identical twin is you had the one fertilized egg in the womb, it split through meiosis, and it made an exact copy of itself, and now there's two. But, I mean, we all know that twins, yeah, they can be similar to each other, but they can also be vastly, drastically different from each other. So, again, genetics in terms of personality, does it have some effect? Sure. Does it have all effect? No. And again, the differences between even me and somebody from Africa or somebody from Asia, less than 5% genetic difference. Okay, I can maybe do one more. Okay, well, in that case, thank you all very much. Again, if you have a question, please write it down, give it to us, and we'll have it ready for Joseph next week. Thank you all for coming. See you next week.